Good morning, everybody. I'm Nicola Barrett, Chief Corporate Learning Officer at Emory Executive Education at Goizueta Business School, and it's wonderful to have you all with us today. For many of you, it's an extremely chilly morning, so hopefully you are staying warm if you're in North America and the pipes haven't burst, and your kids are at school and all of that stuff. We're continuing the theme today from our last Business Over Breakfast with Jamie Turner, who talked about setting goals and performing at our personal best. This week, we're going to review performance and change from an organizational perspective. And by the way, I hope you all received the special email offer to join Jamie's upcoming series on the unspoken rules of leadership. If you haven't, I know we will have a link to that for our Business Over Breakfast folks in the chat or coming up at the end of the webinar. A few years ago, Professor Gary Hamel from London Business School wrote, "The world is becoming more turbulent faster than most companies are becoming more adaptable." And this is a harsh reality that affects organizational performance and individual performance. Think burnout, quiet quitting, low engagement scores, to name a few symptoms of this reality. Today, we're going to hear how the energy-inspired, sustainable organization values energy rather than time as its primary currency to combat these symptoms and build leadership capacity and sustainability. Andrew Deutscher is a performance expert, certified human potential coach, author, and speaker, and he's joining us today to be our guide through this conversation. Through his work at the Energy Project and later at his own firm, Regenerate, he has taught cutting-edge strategies for sustained mental and physical energy to thousands of leaders working in high-pressure disciplines, including professional athletics, the U.S. Air Force, and Fortune 500 companies. His work is designed to help leaders avoid burnout through performance, science-based content and experiences, and he provides guidance on energy-inspired leadership and personal sustainability to some of the world's largest and most well-respected brands, including Coca-Cola, AWS, Nestle, and Zurich. Andrew's road to learning about the importance of managing energy is a personal one, and I suspect he will tell us a little bit about that. But as a senior vice president of Sony Pictures Television, he was a top salesperson distributing major television programs and feature films in domestic syndication, and I think spent most of his time on a plane or in airports in order to do that. So as always, today we want this session to be very interactive, and Andrew is excited to engage with all of you through the chat and Q&A throughout the presentation. So please post your thoughts and questions as we go, and we'll do our best to address them through our hour together. Enjoy the morning with Andrew. I'm sure you're going to learn a lot, and I look forward to the Q&A section. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you, Nicola, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for that introduction. Okay, you ready? I'm excited to be here. I really appreciate the time to connect with all of you on a very important topic that is you, and it's the workplace. So I imagine those two things are quite important to you, especially coming off of the last discussion on goals for 2024 and making it your best 2024. I really now get the opportunity to tell my friends that I actually got into Emory. I can tell you that Emory was not even on my list of schools. I did not have a shot at that. I'm a graduate of Syracuse University, where I majored in business and communications. My dad, not so happy with that I didn't go to a state school in New York, given the cost differential, especially because he felt at that time I really didn't have much direction. But now he sees that I communicate in business, so all that worked out. So as I pull up my slides and we get into today's discussion, I'm going to invite you into the chat. And I'd love for you to just share an answer to a simple question. That question is, what would you do if you had more energy? So just go ahead and pop that into the chat. I will get my slides going, and we will dive into this discussion. All right, we good on the visual there? Excellent.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. All right, let's take a look in the chat here. What would you do with more energy? I would grow my business. Nice. More exercise. Chores and exercise more. Another one. Workout more. Exercise. Wow. Okay. A lot of exercise. Write and speak more. Cook healthy food and work out. Oh, I love that. Start a business. So you can see here pretty quickly as we scroll through this. Read more. Ski faster. Nice. A lot of workout, hobby time, exercise. Does anything kind of occur to you inside of these answers? What do they tend to have in common? Yeah, energy feeds a better life. I love that. More side projects. I mean, all of this richness that it would bring to our lives if we had more energy. Get outside. Let's see if, yeah, their personal lives, volunteering, utilize my focus time for my own training. So this is a pretty amazing thing. And I see this consistently. When you look and you scroll through these things, what won't surprise you is that these are the very things that we actually derive the most energy from. Yet we find ourselves in a position where we would love to do more of these things if we had the energy, and they are the things that we need to plug into to have that energy. So today we kind of want to flip this on its head a little bit and really talk about a workplace that has in large part been overrun with incredibly long work hours, always on reactive workplaces. And I want to set the tone for you here, because if we set the stage personally and then we broaden this out to the organization level, I think you'll better connect with the material. So I'd like for you to imagine your typical day or week. Just think about the meetings, the emails, the managing of career and family obligations that we all have in a world where demands are only increasing. And to really pause here for a moment and reflect and consider the question, how much energy does it take to navigate your personal and professional lives? Even before we define energy, which I will, you have a good sense of what that word means. So how much energy does it really take? And you're probably thinking 100%, maybe more, if that was possible. And the second question is the really important one, because it's how much time and attention do you spend on ensuring you have enough of that energy? Now, Nicola mentioned in the introduction about my time at Sony Entertainment, and I can tell you that was a time when I reflected on those two questions, and the answer was I spend very little energy, or spend a ton of energy, excuse me, navigating everything I needed to do in my life, but there wasn't a lot of time and attention in considering how that energy would be restored, replenished, and utilized. So as a senior executive at Sony, where I was traveling a lot, I witnessed really firsthand the strain of the modern workplace. And then once it became really clear to me, I was not alone in that predicament. I became determined to change that experience for many, and that's the work that we do at Regenerate today. So if we come back to really connecting you with some of this and thinking about this in your own terms before we take it to the workplace level, what were the messages you learned about the role of work in your life? So I'll go back to my dad for a second here. So with my father, work was not finished for the day until it was finished for the day. Now that was a different time, right? Because you could say you actually finished work. There was even a time maybe where you couldn't scroll in your emails and you felt like, oh, I'm done. I can't scroll my emails any longer. But back then in that generation, my dad would work long hours. Sometimes he'd be home at 5 or 6. Sometimes he'd be home at 8 or 9. So the work, he would not come home until it was finished. And I also learned that good enough was not really good enough. Those were a couple of the messages. I got other messages as well, but for this purpose and this topic, that's largely what I grew up understanding around connecting to work and thinking about myself in latter career stages. So what about for you? What did you hear? What did you learn? What were some of the key messages that you learned about the nature of what work means? Pop it in the chat. Thanks, Amy. Work comes first. I think a lot of people can relate to that one. Yeah, work is a priority. It's a duty. It's a good one. Work now, play later. You got to work if you want to eat. Talk about it like a survival message, right? Yeah, if you're going to do it right. I definitely resonate with that one. A necessary evil. So, gosh, forgetting about like getting meaning and purpose in your work. It's just a necessary thing you have to do to get through life. Work is freedom. Yeah, I'll let you read some of these. This is really interesting, and I appreciate hearing from all of you on this. Work becomes our identity. Yep, your value is tied to how hard you work. So again, back to identity. There's a lot of identity wrapped up in the work that we do. So it has a grip on us, sometimes greater than we would like to admit. It defines who you are. It was a requirement. So think about all these messages. And I know on this, this call, this webinar, we have a lot of very ambitious people, high achievement orientation. And it happens to coincide with a workplace that can be pretty unforgiving. And you all may be familiar with kind of the spawn and the development of the wellness era. It really kind of started in earnest in the 2010, 2011, after the huge layoffs and diminished resources and doing more with less. And here may be interesting for you as leaders of your businesses and leaders in society. The question is wellness getting sicker? There's a $50 to $70 billion annual industry, which is a pretty staggering number, 5 to 7% annual growth in spending. And while that's an impressive number, the results are less so. So here's what that's bought us. Year over year increasing healthcare costs, 2/3 of employees worrying about the mental and emotional health of their employees, roughly 25% utilization among those with access to an employer-sponsored plan, and 15% of companies, of all companies, designated as healthy organizations, it's by Josh Berson's company, that go beyond benefits. So that really means to meet the core human energy and holistic needs of its employees. So how did we get here? Well, part of this is some of these narratives and messages and scripting that plays in the background, but there's also a macro force that's really fundamental to how we got here. And it's a simple reality that has impacted all of us. And that is that change comes faster than we can adapt to it. Now, this is not surprising when you consider the volume and pace of change that we experience now on the regular. The brain evolved, however, to function in mostly non-stressed periods of time with occasional big bouts of stress. So think about that. Is that your experience? You're mostly non-stressed, and in few moments you have a lot of stress? That's probably hardly your experience. It's pretty much the opposite of that. That obviously has an impact because that's not what the brain understands or does very well with. So as hard as it may be to accept this reality, our felt sense of overwhelm, the levels of distraction that we experience, much of the anxiety stems from our inability to adapt to the changes at the rate that they're now happening. But oh, how we try. Right? We can work longer hours. We try to push through, maybe when we don't have that much energy. We're trying to contend with this reality. So we just want to name it. And it doesn't mean we acquiesce or we don't build in the skill. In fact, I'm going to talk a lot today about, well, how do you contend with this in a world where that change is just incessant and rapid, where you find yourself in a situation where you're largely trying to keep up and maintain the pace of change, let alone be proactive and think outward more. So there's obviously a result to this in the workplace. And what happens is we overtax our teams. If you think about this at the individual level or at the leader level, how does that play out in our workplaces? Well, here are the top things, and this is me sharing back with you what I hear from audiences and my experience when I was working senior levels in organizations, is we're running fast, but we're doing it with sometimes a lot of lack of clarity or an always-on reactive workplace, dealing with competing priorities between teams that go unspoken, with unrealistic expectations and artificial deadlines that are supposed to serve as motivators, but largely serve as stressors. So just curious, and you can lay it in the chat, if any of these really stand out for you in terms of your experience, because I want this to relate to you. And if there's anything else that you might add to this list. More with less. Oh, yes, always on culture. Turnover, yes, that's actually a really good one when you put those together. I mean, certainly the workloads have increased. A large part of that is high levels of turnover. And one really now often talked about topic inside of these kinds of discussions is just the lack of continuity when people leave and knowledge walks out the door, and how you find answers. You could spend good parts of your day just trying to get back to even with understanding where something's coming from, or trying to get some kind of institutional knowledge. So this is really difficult environment to be operating in on a consistent and daily basis. And this is why, and you've certainly seen statistics around this. I'm going to share a couple here. This won't surprise you that stress pervades the workplace. Here's kind of what has happened that has led to this. So let's really understand that. Change happening really fast, demands exceeding our capacity to meet them, diminished resources. So of course, this is going to put pressure on the workplace, put pressure on teams. And then here we have it, right? Here are some of the symptoms of this. Now, when you look at some of these statistics, the one that really struck me the most, and it may for you, is both kind of sad in its reality, but also a huge opportunity. And that's the middle one, because more than 80% of the pressures that lead to burnout and overwhelm come from our managers and our own self-expectations. So what does that mean? Just to keep you connected into the conversation in the chat, what does that mean? What do you take away from that statistic, that more than 80% of the pressures that lead to burnout in the first place are from manager and self-expectations? Because that may surprise some of you. Hope people are staying with the chat. Some really other good symptoms there of the overtaxing of teams. Yeah, Larry, you nailed it in one word. It's avoidable, right? The problem is in our own houses, so to speak. So this becomes a really interesting opportunity when you think about that big of a number and that it's happening in our own houses. We may often look to our competitors, or to, we have to just be more, bigger and faster, and it's happening out there, but we're doing it to ourselves. So instead of looking out there, we get an opportunity to really look in the mirror and see, how do we want to work? And is the way that we're working really working? And is it sustainable? So we may be productive for a time, but over time we have diminished resources. So we're going to take a look at that. So in terms of really top reasons for people quitting their jobs, this was mentioned in the introduction as well, this McKinsey study is pretty revealing. Let's take the top two off the table, because that's about lack of career development and advancement, and inadequate total comp. So if you're not doing that right, people are walking out the door. But let's just say table stakes, companies are working really hard to satisfy those two things. Then look at all the areas in the green, because this is where it gets really interesting. They have to do with unrealistic work expectations and practices, uninspiring leaders, and frankly, just overall drags on people's energy. So if you really think about, actually, I'll go back for a second, the third one, let's take a look at that. That is uncaring and uninspiring leaders. And studies now suggest that better than 2/3 of leaders find their base level job responsibilities so overwhelming, they find it hard to lead, and certainly lead with high positive energy, because we have leaders as player coaches now. You all know this, you teach this, all the things that are really inside of great leadership with leading don't have to do with actually doing the work. But we find that a lot of leaders are actually working and they're trying to lead at the same time, and that's 2 full-time jobs, and they're tired. So when we really look at what's happening inside of this, we get to understand the symptoms, but do we really understand the true cause so we can appropriately address the modern day challenges of a workforce that is largely depleting scores of workers? So recent strides in occupational health, workplace research, and environmental medicine make it plainly clear we are working longer hours trying to keep up. We're often exhausted, physically, emotionally, or mentally. We are not doing a great job of honoring individual and team boundaries, and we feel incapable often of balancing our own lives despite the stated importance of the organizations that we work for to better manage our lives. So we have more hours in some cases if we're working from home and we have more flexibility, but we feel overall like we have less flexibility because we're now just pushed into more always on environments. And so if we really look at the root cause, it's a bit of a clear and present danger. And don't worry, I know it kind of sounds doom and gloom here. I'm getting to the good part of this. But let's really connect with the reality and understand what's going on there and be honest about the situation we find ourselves in, because demands really fundamentally are exceeding our capacity to meet them. So I imagine that demands are high for you in all of what you do. You probably would expect that demands would continue to rise. But if I ask the question, do you expect your capacity, that's the energy, that's the fuel in your tank, to rise right along up and meet those demands? What would you say about that?
Andrew,
In fact, yep.
Andrew, sorry to interrupt, but I have a question from Barbara that is about a couple of slides back. And she asks, do you have the data for manager-driven versus self-driven stress? So is it coming from, how much of it's coming from managers versus how much of it is it coming from our own expectations and the stress that we're putting on ourselves and the demands we're putting on ourselves?
That's a great question. And in the research for, this is an Indeed 2022 study, we took out from that it was the combined number of manager and self-expectations. I don't think that they separated those two, but we'll take a look into the research. So can we hold that question and we can come back to it?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. And great question. So what age are you when you begin to, just say in the physical dimension of energy alone, begin to lose cardiovascular capacity and strength? What age do you think that happens to us? Again, in the absence of exercise or strength training. People have some opinions on this. Al, nice, already happened. Yeah, it's 30 to 35. Gosh, Amy, 22. No, for God's sakes. 52. Jennifer, you must be doing really well. So 30 to 35 is really the age at which that happens. Now, what else is happening and coinciding with things in your life at that age for many of us? Yeah. Families, kids, promotions, right? Our jobs go to careers. We have more obligations. And so what are some of the very things at that point that we stop doing to try to keep up with those demands? Well, it goes back to the question that I asked you at the beginning. What would you do with more energy? We have less of ourselves in the mix, less of our own refueling and replenishing when we are looking to take care of others and contend with other things. So right around that age, we really stop doing some of the very core things that actually give us energy and fuel us to be at capacity for others, just in the name of trying to keep up and get more done. So what's the story there? Well, we take capacity for granted. Demands are high. They continue to rise. When demands are high, we feel like we need to sort of push away all these other things that are important to us and enable us and provide levels of self-care that fuel our capacity. But because for most of our lives, up until 30 or 35, we had that capacity, we took it for granted. Well, perhaps now there's a way to reconnect to this understanding of when speed and intensity of demand rises, well, that's going to put more pressure on the system. We need to be even more mindful of how we're recovering and refueling in that context. So Albert Einstein is a great quote. He said, "We can't solve our problems with the same thinking that we used when we created them." So the question is, How have we been trying to solve this problem? This problem of eradicating boundaries and relentless demand in the modern workplace. What resource do you rely upon to try to keep up with life and work demands? In the chat, what resource? So you can see here some resources that would really be good for you. Yeah, some of these are really good. The question is, how much of this, are you doing sufficiently and consistently? But predominantly, we find ourselves in a world where we're spending more time to get these things done. But there's a problem with time, isn't there? It's finite. We are largely run by a clock, which then means, in terms of our psychology, a pretty scarce resource. We only have so many hours in the day. And because we've largely run by that mechanism, and it's the way that we meet and talk about meeting time and all those kinds of things and carve out work, of course, time is important and time is precious and how we're spending that time. But we've reached a point where we don't have enough hours in the day. And time is finite. And we know time moves pretty fast as we get older. There's another problem with time as well. If you think about the number of hours that you're spending in a week or in a given day, at a certain point, we get to diminished returns. So you may, in fact, be working longer hours. If you're part of all these statistics, then you are. But if you ask yourself the question, well, am I keeping up with things and getting things done in a real value creation, highly prioritized way? Then what does it really matter if you're spending longer hours? Many of those hours are in a kind of a zone we call diminished resources, or not working on higher order value added work. So we're going to look at another resource to keep up with and better manage life's demands. And the good news is it's very fundamental and foundational, and it's human, and it's our energy. And so if anything, for this conversation is to reconnect you with what you intuitively know is true for you, but we often lose sight of because of the nature of demands and the reactive workplace that only has us looking with visibility maybe 10 feet out in front. But if we really understand energy in the human system, it offers an incredible paradigm and opportunity to seize back our lives and seize back our days in ways that Sean talked about a few weeks ago, to be at our best, to be the best versions of ourselves. So 3 key characteristics of energy. First, we can expand our total capacity. And that's really good news because we can do that at any age or stage. You may know people in their 80s or 90s who are doing Ironmans. We live in a world of incredible human ingenuity and performance science and understanding how to live not just longer, but healthier and more vitality. So we can expand our total capacity. We have that ability to be at greater bandwidth. That's what energy offers us. It also offers us the opportunity, if we manage it really well, to minimize energy depletion. Well, what do we really mean by that? The things that we feel guilty about, the things that we regret, the things that we excessively worry about, the things that play in our minds that go on repeat and we keep coming back to, that drain our energy, we can stem some of that. We have the neuroplasticity, we have the ability to shift that to largely gain energy from minimizing its depletion. And then the third characteristic, which I find to be the most exciting personally for me, is the idea that we can regenerate and we can renew our energy. In fact, we must. It's actually a non-negotiable. When we don't, we begin to see its implications down the road, either in health, sub-performance, or impact to relationships that we really care about. So recovering our energy in a world where energy is so precious and in high demand from us becomes a really important skill set. Now, energy being renewable means that just because it's foundational and fundamental, and most of our days are spent, if we really look at the activities, we're spending or recovering energy, kind of a different way to look at behavior sets and how you're spending time. But if you chart that for the course of a day, what are the things that drain your energy? What are the things that refuel your energy? It's a very simple practice that can be quite life-changing. Because energy is renewable is fundamental, it doesn't mean that we choose to do it, even though it's a non-negotiable. But because it's a non-negotiable, we run into those kinds of issues if we're not mindful about how energy gets restored. So let's explain this a little bit and look at a shared and common definition of energy. So human energy is the internal strength and vitality required for sustained physical, emotional, and mental activity. So if you think about that, two really key words here: internal. We can influence the energy internal roadmap to better meet the demands that are outside of us. And we want to do that in a sustainable way. For many of you, you have not just 1 or 2 years ahead of you, you have a career ahead of you. So thinking about this in the context of sustaining that pace becomes an important skill set. So it's physical energy, it's emotional energy, and it's mental energy, and it's how all of them influence one another, because none is sufficient by themselves. We need to be attending to the whole system. So the value we create is not solely based on hours spent. It's actually the energy invested within those hours that truly creates value. Now, I can promise you, in any consulting engagement that we do or any training that we do, this fundamental principle has to be agreed upon by everyone. Because sometimes leaders or teams think longer we work, the better the outcome. Or we just got to keep giving more and more work because we can't really gauge what the standards are or how much we can possibly get done. But if we shift the conversation to really thinking about value creation, that's not based on hours spent. You all know that. It's really based on how you're showing up around those hours, your degree of concentration, your degree of focus, your degree of attentiveness, your ability to listen and engage with what's going on around you and anticipate problems. All of these skills require you to be fueled and are very difficult to do when we are depleted. So sustainable performance requires, again, non-negotiable, requires periods of regeneration. So in the interest of time, I'm going to share this paradigm with you. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. If you have questions, please put them in the chat, and they can, Nicola and team can help me out. But the fundamental understanding here that I'd like you to have is that human energy is actually quite simple. There's only 4 ways that you can feel, and emotions are the currency of your energy. So this is adapted from Jim Lair. He's a performance psychologist. He worked with Olympic athletes and professional tennis players, and many of you may have seen his work or even engaged with it through Human Performance Institute. So I studied under Jim for some time. I worked at a company called the Energy Project. And the fundamental premise here is that from the horizontal axis, negative to positive energy, and the vertical axis is, let's look at it as low to high, but you see stress and recovery. So when we spend energy, we can spend it for better and for worse. When we recover energy, it can be for better and for worse. So we just want to be able to consider, what are the emotional states that we're feeling? Is it consuming energy? Is it appropriate to the circumstances that we're in? So performance state is when we feel challenged. We feel like we have a clear goal and how to get there. We're working with people that we care about and are excited about, and have the opportunity to do things that are beyond our own self-interest and really make a difference. And that's what I love about this opportunity to speak to you in this Business Over Breakfast episode, because it's kind of at the heart of educational institution, workplaces, trying to make a difference in the world, providing meaning at work. We know when we're in that performance state. We're often not in that state. And when we're not, we're likely still spending energy. So we'll stay on the top. And that survival state is really based on emotions around frustration or anxiety or irritability or impatience. A lot of leaders, they don't necessarily like to lead from here, but if they're depleted on energy and reactive and short and impatient, you're going to experience them a lot from that state. Again, that's a version of them. It's not completely who they are. Or same for ourselves. Now, if we're in survival state for very long, of course, we will drop into a burnout state. So the call to action here is really to understand, when you look around you and you look around at your team, or you're managing up or managing down, and you understand or see that people may be in a survival state, or you can even ask the questions that are relevant and appropriate to understanding their emotional currency, then you can influence that state. But you have to meet them where they are. So when we recover energy, it's not just a means to get out of that survival state and recover from that depletion. what we know from performance state and working better, and why all these things around energy just so happen to do with sort of personal or hobbies and exercise, things that we consider outside of work, are fundamental to working really well. Recover well, work well. That is the right side of the quadrants. And the right side of the quadrants has to be cultivated. That just doesn't happen by accident. We will largely be reactive and fall into the left-hand side of the quadrants. So for us to influence that performance state, we really, for most of us, our experiences, we first need to recover. But often we find ourselves sort of toggling back between survival and performance, and that's very energy draining. So understanding of this model, we have the opportunity, because we've seen it's in our own house, to create energy-inspired, sustainable organizations. How do we do that? Well, or how do companies do that? Well, number one, you need to address the exhaustion and acknowledge it and really begin to understand how long hours just increases more stress, doesn't help us get more done. And we can do that through capacity building by helping people understand energy. And we can do that across all levels because there's relevance at any age or stage of life in terms of understanding your internal reserves. The sustainable organization looks at preventing acute stress from becoming chronic stress. That's the difference between performance and survival. People want to be stretched. They want to grow. So we don't have to be safe around that idea. We actually want to encourage a healthy challenge stress. That is performance. That's where growth happens. But if we put too much stress on the system, if we're overwhelming that, it gives way to chronic stress. And that's where the real problem is. And then finally, they equip and invest in energy-inspired leaders to fuel optimism, resilience, and sustainable performance. So let's take a couple of these at a turn. If we really think that increasing workload and overall working longer means we'll get more done, we probably really need to kind of sit down and come to terms with the reality that that's no longer true. It is when we expand internal capacity to meet higher demands that we could actually improve life conditions overall, be more engaged, and keep up with the pace of change. We are better able to prioritize when we are in a focused state to be staying inside of the things that really do produce the most value and advocate for those things inside of our organizations. The second thing is preventing acute stress from becoming chronic stress. So one thing to make really clear here is sometimes we feel like we just do stress management or we reduce stress that's going to help retain and preserve. But really what we're lacking or missing in many cases is distinguishing good, healthy challenge stress, getting somebody out of their comfort zone, giving them new looks and different variety inside of their work days, actually put them in a position to be somewhat uncomfortable, but to feel like they're growing. And that enables a more engaged and high performance workforce because you're making sure you're putting them in that performance state. And then you're smart enough to understand that there needs to be a good degree of recovery around that. So we can sort of, as much as we can, sort of keep people to the right side of those quadrants. And then finally, we do it through great leaders. Leaders who are more optimistic and who are focused on really trying to influence that performance pulse between spending energy and recovering energy really bring the greatest amount of change and growth to organizations. And you probably can think of somebody in your mind right now who leads with that kind of high positive energy. And their value is just, you can't overstate it. They prevent people from leaving. They instill excitement around performance. They encourage kindness and compassion in the workplace. They bring people together, right? And they're always showing up around a good, healthy, positive attitude. So I'm going to pause here just because I've been talking for a while, see if I missed anything in the chat or the Q&A. We're right around 9:40, so this is typically the point at which I would answer some questions. I also have some practices that you can take away that sometimes exist inside of some of the questions that you may ask. So I'm happy to continue to kind of move through the presentation, but I just want to pause here for a moment and just see if we have any questions.
We've got a couple, Andrew. So I have a question for you around how can companies, so a lot of this is sort of on individuals and on the managers, but how can companies change so that people have more control and more agency, which are things that I believe, help reduce stress. It's been if you control what you're doing and how you're doing it more, the sort of the stress can reduce. So
Yeah.
companies do.
Yeah. Well, in my experience, what happens at the organizational level now depends on the size and scope of that company, right? But what happens at the organizational level is largely determinative by what's happening at that strong leader level. Yet often we will find leaders who will say they kind of look around and say, well, there's always someone above me. You know, if they're not doing it, then I'm kind of in my own little cocoon over here, and I'm just trying to protect my team, and they're trying to buffer. But even their team knows they can see it. We can see energy, right? When it's if people are trying to buffer that, it doesn't really work very well. So where I see really kind of this pervading a workplace is more through the team level. And then when teams start to really flourish, you find that people want to go work for those leaders and go inside of those teams. And then that leader gets recognized and they start expanding their scope. So it can happen sort of gradually, but I find that at the real large organizational level, this is a very difficult shift, but you can make a significant difference if you look at this at the divisional or the team level.
I see. So Denise,
So that values, though, I would say is it's got to start with a company that's really focused on those values and
right.
lives them from day one.
So I think that feeds into Denise's question about how does a company's culture and mission play into reducing workplace stresses?
So much. I love the question because I think that's where you want to look. You know,
And,
you really look at it.
Let me just add another one that just came in from Satina, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. Can you explain more about the always on culture? So I think those two things play together. Those questions play together.
Yeah, no, they certainly do. So when it comes to mission, vision, and values, and everyone on this call, I think, knows this. Some companies more or less prioritize those efforts. And then for many, unfortunately, they'll go through really good values exercise and then they kind of get put into a booklet and then up on a shelf. And they don't live and breathe in the system. And then people are not held accountable to the values around the character and the ways of working and who we want to be and how we want to work. Because when we have people that are outside of that spectrum of what the company says we value and we hold closely, and then allows those things to take place, then people start to give up around that. They don't really believe in the core values anymore. So it takes a lot of work and diligence and vigilance for companies to, if you're going to go through a values and culture exercise, to make sure that lives and breathes through the system and that people are held account. If you're not doing that, right, there's not much of an opportunity because people see that. They know when they're taking an engagement survey for the 5th time and the company hasn't responded to anything inside of that. So people are smart. That's when they start to leave. And unfortunately, they may find kind of something similar but different at another company. In terms of the always on workplace, here's how I would describe it. You wake up in the morning, you feel like you have to check your phone because you're working across different time zones and stuff has come in overnight and it may get your attention. Largely, it's something that's going to fuel dopamine or something positive. You're waking up in a survival state. You get to the office, or if you're working from home, you might be having some technical challenges, or like we talked about before, there's lack of clarity around things, or you're trying to get in touch with somebody, but they're sick today and I can't find the answer to this. And people need answers and you are back to back in meetings. And then by the time you get to the evening, there's some time there, whether it's before or after dinner, that you hope that you have some energy that you could check the emails that you didn't get to during the day. Painting a really tough picture here, but that's what I mean when we say an always on workplace. And people expect answers. They expect responsiveness. Did you get my email? Right? Did you get that text? If they didn't, they're trying some other mechanism to try to get a hold of you. So that's kind of the always on. It doesn't leave a lot of room for regenerating and recovering because it keeps you in that upper echelon of an energy spend state, for better or for worse.
Thank you. And for my team, I have over 700 unread emails. So don't send me another one. It's like I've
They're
got
probably trying other channels now to get a hold of you. Yeah.
um, um Dionisio asks, is there a higher reliable formula to make the transitions needed to take an organization to a strong, sustainable level? So
Are there,
I think
say that again.
they're asking for a recipe here.
Yeah, can you repeat the question again? I just want to unpack that.
Is there a higher reliable formula to make the transitions needed to take an organization to a strong, sustainable level?
Oh, I love the question. So if we're talking about formulas or simple ways to think about this, there is we look at capacity plus competency equals sustainable high performance. So if we first establish that a company or a leader set says the way we're working isn't really working, maybe we're getting results, maybe we're winning sometimes, not other times, but the way we're working is really draining people. We have the data for that. We know it. We want to be more sustainable. Well, what does sustainable really look like? It means that we need to have the competence, the skill and talent of people, hiring really good people to do really good work. But that's only part of the formula. The other part of the formula is capacity. That's the energy required to bring your skill and talent to life. So I would encourage, if you really just want to share that in kind of a discussion format, how are we doing on capacity? How are we doing on competency? Do we have a workforce that is all three things in terms of readiness, right? They're showing up with good, positive energy and in a state to really play. Are they willing, right? Are they motivated? Do they connect to the values and the big picture? And then finally, are they able, right? Can they do the job? So they might be full of energy and they might be very motivated, but they just can't do the job, or they can't do the job really well at the levels that you need them to. We need to check all three. So that is inside of a formula of capacity, energy, and then competency, skill, and talent. And that equals sustainable performance.
Oops, mute.
Yes, agreed, Gary. In the chat, there's some good stuff in the chat there too to make sure people are looking into that.
You're most welcome, Precious, to come by the office. Anyone's welcome. Another question from Scott. Can you clarify capacity and how we increase it? He says, I understand the restoring of energy, but what's this the notion of capacity and increasing capacity?
Okay. So great question. Think about capacity as synonymous with your energy, and human energy being made up of your physical energy. So that's the quantity and quality of your sleep, the degree of how much you move throughout a day, how you properly fuel yourself through nutrition and manage your blood sugar, and through rest. So periodic moments of intentional rest could be through just quieting the mind, could be through a practice of meditation, but also could just be through journaling and sitting quietly, sitting outside, getting sunlight in your eyes, having a conversation with a loved one. All of those things constitute, some degree of rest, in that they're disconnected from the always on workplace. Then there's emotional, and that's the quality of our energy. So we talked about that in the 4 different ways that you feel. So cultivating positive emotion is the whole domain of, we need to be intentional about how we cultivate positive emotion. And there's a whole constellation of things around that, from our ability to reframe things and to hold a positive attitude in the face of some negative situations at times, and being honest with yourself about the emotion and letting that in and acknowledging it and processing it and working through it. And then, of course, there's the mental domain of our energy, and that's the ability to focus, right? And do the things that are healthy for our brain and our body, that help us bring to bear greater levels of focus and attention and concentration. So that's capacity. It's physical, it's emotional, and it's mental.
Thank you. Rebecca asks, when someone comes with positive energy and finds ways to stay in that high performance mode, it seems like the reward is more work. So how do you encourage organizations to let them feel the benefits of balancing their energy and not load on more? I feel
that's such a good
in
question.
our school system too.
Yeah, I mean, think about how loaded this is. You know, when we do really good work, we're rewarded with even more work. And then we want to believe that we have the unlimited bandwidth for that. This situation tends to be more the responsibility of, if you're the individual where that's happening, to be able to sort of artfully, or how you articulate that you are high performing, that you are willing to do a lot and you can take on a lot. But there comes a certain point at which that is really my bandwidth. Like if I'm going to take on any more, what are we going to say no to? And I think it's a good high performance discipline to say, if there's an additional thing we're bringing into the system, what are we taking out? We can't just keep adding in. It's not a very prudent business strategy. So I think talking about it from a business discipline, and also understanding that we don't want to do that to other people as well. When we do that to a few people, we're putting even greater amounts of pressure on them and ultimately making them go from performance to survival. So I think showing someone just that simple quadrant set, and then being able to articulate at a certain point of volume and workload that needs to be really offset by some recovery, means that we have to really limit the additional things that we're putting onto the system, because now we're going to push people over to the left side.
So I think we have a short course on negotiation and influence sometime this year. So if people want to take that so that they improve their skills in terms of managing that situation, please think about it.
Yeah, for sure. We have a really great webinar. We call them webinars, on Say It Ain't No. And it's really an entire hour on how to do that, and the importance of that. It's one of those things that's for this year going to be super important. I think even Sean talked about that a little bit. So yeah, Essentialism is a great book.
Yeah. Raja asked, what are some good strategies to creating awareness of these dynamics with the executive team to prompt change top down? Or at least
I think a really good way
change to happen.
Yes. Well, it needs to be visceral. We need to feel it, right? Whether at the individual level, leader level, or organizational level, we have to believe that there is a real problem there. And we have to want to change. So we have to have what we call the willingness gauge. And the way we can heighten people's willingness around that is, first of all, them really understanding some of these ideas. Secondly, if you give somebody, when we do this in sessions, we give them an energy assessment. And so if you take an energy assessment at the individual, we also have an organizational one, and you really start to look at, wow, we're pretty depleted here. I'm operating at 55% of my total capacity. And for most leaders and heads of companies, we find that they agree with the percentages. They say, it feels about right. I'm at 60, 65%. And it's unacceptable, for people who want to perform and want to achieve. So when they actually take the instrument, and it's very simple, 20 statements, look at your own energy. You look at how you're spending your time, hopefully. Why wouldn't you look at how you're spending your energy? So, because it's a performance discipline, a lot of leaders and companies are, oh yeah, we want more performance. Let's look at this as a performance instrument. And then they see they're not operating at full capacity, and they can step into some change that they may not have otherwise considered.
I think we've got time for one last question. Any recommendations for that you have for a team or a person, to address a team or a person who looks like they're on that sort of burnout path? What can we do to either help a colleague avoid going too much further down that burnout path?
Yeah, this, I'm sure you've heard some answers in these spaces before, but ones that I really do subscribe to is, this is where bringing a bit of vulnerability to the equation can be very helpful. You can share your own story before you want to and expect to hear someone else's story. To the degree that you really care, that they know that you care, and the equity that you have in that more or less allows you to walk through that door. So I think the important thing that comes up a lot in these conversations is leaders, they're not expected to be the EAP solution for their teams. They are expected to recognize it and then be able to move to higher ground and provide additional resources. But I think for a leader who really cares about their team and their people, let them know that. First of all, just let them know. We've been running hard lately. You know, we lost that thing recently, or we're gearing up for a really big thing. And I'm aware of the reality that some of you may be tired. So can we talk about that? How does it show up for you? Physical, emotional, mental? Some of you have had your cameras off recently, and usually we're a camera on, team. Or I'm not hearing from people as much, or there's shorter answers, or there's the emails are, not answering the questions, and, just pull together some of the symptoms. They're out there. And then, be willing to have a real conversation, and not just at the 5 minutes before your meeting, at the 5 minutes at the end. Have a dedicated meeting around capacity. And I think that way, you don't have to be so great at spotting it or picking it out all the time. To the degree that you're talking about it, you're going to invite people to bring it to you more. And I think that's probably the better way to go.
Well, thank you. This has been really interesting, and I hope that everybody on this webinar, I think they've engaged and taking away a lot of interesting things to think about and reflect on for yourself and your teams and your organizations. I am going to hand over to Jen Eames to close us out. Thanks so much, Andrew.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew. We really appreciate your time today. So before we wrap up, I just have a couple of quick bits of information on what's coming next with Emory's Executive Ed program. Our next two Business Over Breakfast series will continue in February, on February 1st. Bob Kelly will present what's new in B2B sales, a management briefing on best practices and emerging trends. Then on February 15th, Carl Kunert will present decision-making twins using AI to teach ethics. In addition to that, we have a few upcoming open enrollment programs. As Nicola mentioned earlier, we have Unspoken Rules of Leadership workshop series, which are an hour-long live online sessions that take place over lunch. And I believe those are every Friday in February. For all webinar attendees, all Business Over Breakfast attendees, we are offering a 10% discount on that series. You can use code BOB2024 when you register, and more information will show up in the chat soon, so you can link right to that. We also have two in-person programs coming up, our Managerial Leadership Program. That is 2 sessions, April 15 through 17 and May 22nd to 23rd. And Executive Communication and Leadership Presence, April 23rd to 24th. Pam just posted it in the chat. Please click on the link to learn more. And thank you again for attending. Have a great weekend.